Dante Certification Level 2, 2nd Edition. Firmware Updater. In Dante Certification Level 1, you might remember that we said Dante interfaces can be separate infrastructure from the host device. This modular design makes it easier for manufacturers to add Dante to their product. And in that case, that usually means the Dante firmware is separate from the host device firmware. You'll probably need to update both pieces separately. Now, before you do an update for a device, consult the manufacturer to make sure you know how the process will operate. It's also not unusual for a manufacturer to specify a specific Dante firmware version to go with their host device firmware. When they went through testing, that will be the pairing that they've tried. There are also times that manufacturers will insist on matching firmware on related products, like a mixer and a stage box, or a DSP and a panel. By insisting these related devices have a coordinated firmware in them, they're ensuring that they'll be running the same version of a control API. So again, this is about the host device firmware, not the Dante firmware. At Audinate, we take backwards compatibility very seriously. We do extensive regression testing with any new release candidate, ensuring it's compatible with all of the Dante firmware already in the field. And from that point, manufacturers do further testing before they release it in their product. To find out what firmware versions you have in your products, you can use Dante Controller's Device View tab to get a quick view of the firmware on all your devices at once. Here, you'll find separate listings for the host firmware version and the Dante firmware version. Sometimes the interface doesn't list a particular host version, and that's okay. In this case, this is an option card that goes into a mixing desk. The option card itself doesn't have very much functionality. It all comes from the mixer itself. If you need more information, perhaps when you're on the phone with tech support, they may direct you to the Device View Status tab. That can reveal more detailed information with firmware versions of specific parts of the host device and the Dante interface alike. Okay, so let's talk about the process of updating your firmware. In 2019, Audinate updated Dante Controller so it had a firmware update tool built in. You can access it from this icon in the tool ribbon. In fact, since my network is connected to the internet, it's automatically scanned my devices on the network and compared my firmware versions with a database online. So it's telling me that there are firmware updates available for my devices right now. So some people will ask us, do I need to put in the latest firmware all the time? It's a personal decision. Some people like to do it just in case there was a security update. Other people wait until there's a feature that they want to take advantage of. But either way, all we're doing here is telling you that the firmware is available, and then we leave it up to you as to when to put it in. To put the firmware in, let's click on the icon to open the firmware update window. The system will automatically identify the devices that we know have an update available. For any devices we're not sure about, we'll put them in this Consult Manufacturer tab. Okay, so let's show you how to do an update. I'll choose the two Avio adapters I have here and click Update Selected Devices. The system will remind me that this will reboot devices, and that means we'll have an audio or video interruption. I'll agree and click Update Now. Firmware Updater will automatically download the firmware and start to push it into the device. Now, I'll fast forward through the progress bars here, but the elapsed time to update these two devices was about 45 seconds. We can close this window and we'll wait for the Avio adapters to process the new firmware and reboot. Of course, don't disturb the devices during this process either. When the process is complete, we'll see the devices come out of the Updates Available list. Now they'll show up in the Up to Date list. I'll come back to my Device Info tab. If I refresh my view, we'll see the Avio adapters are updated and their new firmware version is reflected. Now, before 2019, we had a separate program to do that. Just in case you get a manufacturer that suggests using the older program, I'll give you a walk through that as well. So over here, I have the Dante Firmware Update Manager program. All we have to do is answer the questions in order. We start by choosing the network port we want to use. In a sense, we have to do the same thing in Dante Controller or virtual sound cards, right? Next, we ask to update the Dante firmware. The other option here, the fail-safe recovery, that's only there in case your update goes wrong. Like let's suppose a device loses power while you were pushing a firmware update in. Chances are, if you're using that, you're on the phone with tech support. Okay, so we select Update Dante Firmware. Next, we need to locate the firmware update file on your computer. This is probably something you downloaded from the manufacturer's website. Now, just below that, you'll see a checkbox for Override Device Matching. Our firmware update files include information in them about the chipsets they'll run on, maybe specific model numbers that they load to. And our firmware update tool will use that information in the next screen to only show you the devices that are compatible with the firmware file you've selected. So, when would I override that? Maybe a manufacturer gives you a beta firmware, and they didn't have time to fill in all that information. At that point, they might tell you, just check the box, Override Device Matching, and then be very careful in the next screen to make sure that you choose the right device. But otherwise, you will leave that box unchecked. So as we said, we go into the next screen and we'll only be shown the devices that are compatible with this firmware. So right now, I've just got my one mixer in here. But let's suppose we were updating a wall of amplifiers, right? And they all needed the same update. The firmware update tool does allow you to load to multiple devices at once, but check with the manufacturer to make sure that's supported. Once you're updating multiple devices at the same time, it can take a little bit longer, and sometimes the products themselves will have an internal timeout that will just end the process. So if the manufacturer says do one at a time, do one at a time. If they say they support multiples at once, have at it. All right, so I select my console and I push start. I'll confirm that the process should begin, and we're underway. Now, I'll fast forward through this process as well. It took about 1.5 minutes in real time. I get my pop-up telling me the update is complete, so I'm all set. So remember, because Dante capabilities are often added as a separate chipset, its firmware may be separate from the host device. The manufacturer's firmware will likely update differently, so check with the instructions from them. You may also discover that the manufacturer requires a particular pairing of firmware, either between Dante firmware or host device firmware across multiple related products. As of 2019, Dante Controller includes Dante Updater. If an internet connection is available, it can automatically scan your network and tell you if a Dante firmware update is available. You choose when to put the updates in, and it will automatically download and install it for you. Now, before that, we had Dante Firmware Update Manager. That's still available and supported. Since it is designed to work without an internet connection, sometimes that's easier to use on isolated networks. And of course, it's worth reiterating that Dante devices on the network can be of varied Dante firmware versions. They'll still work together.